"It's been a pleasure to meet you, Mr. Hagrid," said Cecilia, extending her hand. Hagrid smiled, but looked down at her extended limb. "You shake it," prompted Cecilia, and grinned when Hagrid took her whole wrist in his hand, and worked it up and down. "Same for you, Mrs. Frobisher." "Cecilia," interjected Cecilia. "Cecilia," continued Hagrid, grinning down at her. "You're one of the nicest muggles I've ever met. I am sorry to hear about the dreadful events of last week. Please come to visit, any time," he added, gesturing towards the hut door. 88,888,888. Late, thought Cecilia, as she hurried up the stairs to the main teaching area, and down again to the dungeons. "I hope he's not already there. I made enough of a fool of myself yesterday." She reached the large boss door soon after, and opened it, scanning the room for Snape. "Sorry, I got delayed," she said automatically to the empty room. "Oh," she thought, looking round, and her gaze caught the experiment setup. She checked the setup again, and despite nothing having changed from that morning, she readjusted the aperture on the microscope and refocused the objective lens. "Well, there's nothing else for it but to wait," she thought, and sat down on one of the stools with Magic and Moles rechecking the facts about squibs and Moleborns. Snape arrived an hour later, striding in with a face of stone. "Explain, Cecilia," he intoned, gesturing towards the equipment. Ignoring his lateness, she quickly detailed the aim and purpose of the setup, and linked it back to the hypothesis of both Mole and Wizard cells reproducing mitotically. "I need samples from both a Mole and a Wizard," she said, and pressed on without leaving him time to continue. "I've already got my own, so if you want to watch the mitosis in the lymphocytes, that should give you some idea of what we're talking about." "So what sample do you need?" he asked, sitting down on the bench near her. Cecilia sighed. "I already have mine," she said, holding a vial of blood. She paused. The ball was in his court. Whatever his reaction was now, that was the real test of their working relationship. "I feel that in order to make this a fair test, you should take the sample yourself," said Snape, rolling up the right sleeve of his robe. "I assume you have the necessary equipment?" Without saying anything, Cecilia pulled out another sterile needle from her bag. She pulled out the needle and attached it firmly to the accompanying syringe, ensuring that there was a tight fit. She glanced up at Snape as she approached him. "Are you sure?" "Of course. You did it yourself, and you're still around," he retorted. "That's not exactly what I meant," thought Cecilia, and held his right arm, which he'd exposed from under his robe. An hour later, and Cecilia was feeling on top of the world. Not only had the experiment worked for her blood sample, illustrating clearly the division of the white blood cells as they merrily made copies of themselves, but also Snape's evident fascination with what he had seen. "Remarkable," he said, glancing over at Cecilia. "I never thought the human body could hold so many marvels." "Did you see the second phase?" asked Cecilia, eagerly. He nodded. "It's both of those things," she said, "both of those phases. A similar process happens in the gametes when they reproduce before fertilization." She reached across for Snape's blood sample and began to prepare another slide. "Your turn," she said, as she allowed a few drops of blood to cover the slide, and added the peroxide solution, slipping on the thin sheet of plastic to prevent the sample sticking to the lens. She handed it to Snape. "Just take the other one out," she said, as he looked uncertainly at her. "And put this one in its place. It's your blood after all. You deserve to be the first of us to see." Taking the slide from her, he did as she had said, and Cecilia stood back, trying to stop herself from pacing. When he was still staring down the microscope, her patience finally gave way and, as politely as she could, asked, "Severus?" "Yes," he said, stepping aside from the microscope and turning to her. My cells are doing the same as yours. They are reproducing. I can clearly see the metaphase stage. It's mitosis, Cecilia, as you described. There was wonder in his voice. Yes, shouted Cecilia, walking over to him and looking down. I can't believe it. But she had to. It was happening, right there and then, before her very eyes. She looked back at Snape. You know what this means then? She said, smiling at him. When he didn't reply, she continued. That we've taken the first step in understanding the difference between moles and wizards. He looked back at her, his face impassive. Eventually, he spoke. I must apologize, Cecilia, he said at last. Until just now I doubted your commitment to this work, this research. I believed that you saw it as an excitement, entertainment. I was wrong. I even doubted you after Black's attempt on your life. Forgive me. She had never seen that expression on his face before. There seemed to be genuine regret there. There's nothing to forgive, Severus, said Cecilia. But I have to admit, I felt the same towards your attitude. Up until you looked down that microscope. When you did that, you showed that you weren't just paying lip service to science. You actually understand it, and want to know how to use it. Her voice trailed off and an absence of spoken dialogue ensued, and Cecilia and Snape looked at each other, conveying unspoken professional respect. Finally, Snape spoke. So, the cells replicate, he said, nodding towards the slides. They are similar in that respect. What we need to look for now is how they are different. Cecilia nodded and looked back over at Snape's sample again. I'll need to make a detailed sketch of this, she said, and compare it to my own. She looked back up. Are you certain there are no records of any wizards who have studied this deeply? Snape shook his head. Then I think what we'll need to do is test both of our samples for amino acid content in the assay. If there are any significant differences, this might give us a lead. Cecilia sat down next to Snape again on the bench, and considered the day's work. It had been excellent. Half an hour later and Cecilia and Snape were in her room discussing what they were going to try next. Snape had suggested the effect of magic on the cells, and Cecilia agreed, but with one proviso. We need to consider whether all wizard cells behave like this, she said, nibbling the end of her pencil. I mean, reading that book I bought, it would suggest that squibs are just like moles in the way that they are not able to do magic, but we don't know if it's scientifically true. Also, what about the distinctions you make, about mole-born wizards, and purebloods? This may make a difference to Harry. She leaned back against the stone wall of the room, relaxing as best she could against it. We should test whether the mitosis responds to magic, said Snape, looking at her. If mine does, and yours does not, this may also suggest a difference in the cells themselves. Cecilia had to concede. She wondered how long it would take him to spot the next logical step that she had tried to ignore, taking the trouble to stress the science side of the work rather than the magic side. You are right, of course, said Cecilia, inclining her head downwards and rubbing her temples. Perhaps we should progress on to that tomorrow? When he did not reply, Cecilia looked back up. Ahead of us continuing this discussion, Cecilia, might I ask how far the events of last week have affected you? Before she had time to deny it, he added, in particular, your reaction last night. Cecilia stood up. I trust you, Severus, she said, evenly. And I am sure you understand by now that I would never do anything unprofessional. She looked at him, feeling a little unsettled. All I can say is, if I had not made the monumental error which was leaving last Friday night, I would not feel as concerned about the effects of magic. I would not be as jumpy every time my fire flickers, or anticipate every corner in case Peeves has actually got hold of whatever the house elves are cooking to wang in my direction. She sagged, thinking about the near miss she'd had that very morning, and sat down on the bed, glancing at the floor, then looked back up to face him. Most importantly, I wouldn't look like I'd gone 6 rounds with Frank Bruno and we might have got to this stage by last week. She sighed, making the most of the forthcoming silence. I will get over this though, she added, when he'd said nothing. But I need to ask for your patience. Snape stood up and walked towards the door. They have affected you more than I imagined, he intoned, and there was a slight edge to his voice, and he walked back towards Cecilia, taking one of her hands between his icy own momentarily, in an apparent comforting gesture. It may not appear objective when I say this, Cecilia, but I know Black, and his friends. I know what they're like and how they behave. They were the same at school, and nothing has changed. In particular Black's audacity to do anything to get exactly what he likes. He stopped, and Cecilia noticed a bitter edge to his voice which in some strange way was actually rather comforting and made her feel a little less paranoid. We should continue along both paths, said Snape, his voice returning to its usual tone and resonance. I can obtain more samples of wizard blood, that won't be a problem. Now I am more familiar with the phenomenon of cellular reproduction, Cecilia, I can take the lead on that side. Remarkable, thought Cecilia, and was amazed at his response to their work for the second time that day. More amazing still is that he had considered her feelings, something which she never would have believed possible, even a day ago. She nodded in agreement. Tomorrow then? She said, nodding towards Snape as he made his way towards the door. 6, he intoned, and closed the door behind him. For a few minutes Cecilia stared at the closed door, thinking about the day's events, before locking it firmly and pulling off her clothes in lieu of a wash and a sleep. Had she been thinking a little more clearly and taken more notice of the little events that had contributed to the small but significant details of the day, she may have taken care to glance in the direction of the fireplace. 88,888,888. The week progressed quickly and their research became further embedded in science. By Wednesday, Snape had been able to make the cells in his blood sample respond using a variety of spells, with corresponding null results in Cecilia's. Concurrently, Cecilia had made further progress with the origin of the wizard blood, and in particular had found here was a significantly higher proportion of beta-amino acid in the pure blood and half-blood samples, with more in the Mull-borne samples and comparable normal levels in Squib and Mull. In addition, she continued to add to her already comprehensive analysis of ingredients and potions. Cecilia had also visited Madame Pomfrey again, and the healer had provided her with some notes of her grandfather's, and Cecilia read them through avidly, paying particular attention to the man referred to in the notes as Raymond Lully. It appeared that Lully had been a particular help when Pompops Pomfrey had been perfecting potions and curing moles. However, Cecilia could find no reference of him in the library, and even Pompop's own notes made scant reference to his method of determining effective and safe potions for moles. I expect you'll be needing some more potion yourself, Cecilia said Madame Pomfrey, on Thursday. You'll be out of it now, I suppose. Cecilia looked up absently from the Pompops's notes. She had taken to reading them in the hospital wing when Madame Pomfrey was around, as she was able to provide details from what she remembered about him. Yes, Poppy, she said guiltily, thinking about the potion still sitting in her bottom drawer, and made a mental note to get rid of it and return empty vial. It says here, continued Cecilia, that the goblin riots are becoming more prolific. She looked on, and Pompops was not able to go to many of the Mull hospitals, despite an increase in the number of cases. Oh, he'll be referring to the riots of 1956, said Poppy, as she busily mixed a tincture near at the other end of the hospital wing. It was the precursor to the dark times, the evil times. She looked up and set down her work. It was thought that you know who was behind the riots, though it was never proven, she explained carefully, looking up at Cecilia. He whipped up a frenzy within the goblin community regarding their status as slaves when they were more magical than moles. It led to many hundreds of moles being killed, and in the end the goblins and wizard banks the world over rioted in the streets. "How come I've never heard of that?" said Cecilia, intrigued. "Granted, not the goblin riots, but those of moles?" "It was all put down to the Cold War," said Madame Pomfrey. "It was decided between the powers of Europe, when our Minister for Magic contacted them, that they would be covered up in exchange for the ringleader's capture." "But it's still going on," said Cecilia. "The ringleader has never been caught." "It got much worse than either the mole or wizard governments could ever have imagined, and the repercussions are still being felt." She looked pointedly at her. Cecilia sighed. "Even the little people have an effect on the world," she said, half to herself. "How profound of you to say so," said Madame Pomfrey, going back to her potion. "I didn't," said Cecilia, looking back through Pompop's notes again. "But what Tolkien was talking about was make-believe." 88,888,888. Later that evening, Cecilia could not sleep. Snape had walked out of their research session an hour earlier, which was a great pity. Not only had Cecilia wanted to tackle the beginning of atomic theory, but she was also quite disconcerted because up until then their work was proceeding well. Lying on the bed she thought about the discussion they had had earlier that evening, trying to get to the bottom of what had gone on. She'd been testing more of Snape's potions and had come to Wolfsbane, a powerful potion which Snape had explained allowed a werewolf in their human form to keep their minds during transformation, thereby sparing them the ignobility of wanton savagery. Cecilia had laughed aloud at the notion, despite Hagrid having said not so many days ago that they inhabited the Forbidden Forest. Snape had been astounded, not least in contrast to Cecilia's open-mindedness to other magical phenomena. "There are limits," she said. The conversation had shifted then to school and Cecilia had asked him about teaching potions. She described the experience of teaching mole children and was surprised to find there was very little difference in their general attitude to school and learning. Cecilia had said that this must be anecdotal evidence to show how alike moles and wizards actually were. But when the conversation led on to family traits and inheritance, something which Cecilia considered the next logical step in the research, Snape had gone silent, and she had found it very hard to coax anything out of him. Worse still, when she tried to extend the theory of mitosis to Gametian reproduction, meiosis, he had given her a cold look and departed without saying a word. She'd asked him if he was well. She'd saw him wipe his forehead with the back of his hand and once or twice grip his left forearm once or twice. What had she said, thought Cecilia to herself. She'd mentioned about children of wizards and moles too, and she'd speculated about the parents of the people whose blood samples they were to be testing. Cecilia sat up, and thought about the theory they still had to cover and wondered whether collision theory of atoms was wholly appropriate. Maybe she needed to understand the work of Gregor Mendel and Darwin, to get over the idea of genes and DNA. But he actually needed to be here so they could do it. She glanced down at the fire, lost in thought, and it was a moment before she noticed the head, glowing emerald green in the hearth. "Watcher!" came a familiar voice, and Tunks's image appeared in flame. "Tunks! This is a surprise!" cried Cecilia, jumping. "How are you?" "How are you, more to the point?" she asked, and Cecilia sat cross-legged in front of the fire. "I've felt better," she said, looking across at the younger woman. "I'm more frustrated actually." "Half a mo, Cecilia, and I'll come over. I'm only in Hogsmeade, and the fire dimmed to nothing." Cecilia sat back, her legs feeling cold against the flagstones, and smiled. Tunks, she thought, remembering the pretty witch with multicolour hair, and that wonderful shopping trip to M&S. "Well, that explains the green fire I keep seeing," she thought to herself, and actually felt much brighter at the prospect of her visit. 88,888,888. Half an hour later, Tunks had arrived and had reasoned with her that if Snape had left that evening, and she couldn't carry on with anything worthwhile, then she should throw caution to the wind and join her at the Three Broomsticks. They headed out of the teacher's area. Tunks had insisted on taking her through the back way of the castle, through a secret passage and out into an open field, where the lights of Hogsmeade twinkled in the distance, complementing the full moon. When Cecilia asked why they simply hadn't gone through the front gates of Hogwarts, she smiled inwardly as Tunks explained that it didn't feel like proper rebelliousness otherwise. It was getting a bit cold now, and the late summer sun had long since dipped over the horizon. When Cecilia had shivered, wishing she had brought a jacket with her, Tunks had realized and conjured one there and then, and Cecilia had to admit that there were advantages of magic. "2 butterbeers," said Tunks, when they got inside. "How are you tonight, Rosie?" "Oh, fine, you know," said Madame Rosmeter, pouring the drinks. "A lot better when school starts. That's when our biggest trade is." "Yourself?" "Super," she said, then leaned conspiratorially over the bar. "But you know, it would be really handy if we could stay here a bit," she said, looking over and nodding towards Cecilia. "Man trouble," she clarified. Madame Rosmeter nodded. "Seeing as it's you, Tunks," she said, and then frowned slightly. "Who is she, anyway?" "Just a friend," said Tunks, taking the butterbeers. "Had a few problems with a relative of mine," she winked. "So I told her I'd take her to the best place I knew to forget about him." Madame Rosmeter came out from behind the bar and headed towards the door. Shutting it before her and turning the sign round, she nodded and said, "Take all the time you need, I'll just be in the back." "Here you go," said Tunks, placing the drinks on the table. "You'll like this." Cecilia looked at it a little suspiciously. "What is it?" she asked, warily. "Butterbeer," said Tunks, sipping it. "It's lovely, try a bit," she said, gesturing towards the glass. "Thanks, Tunks," replied Cecilia, but, still cautious of drinking remotely anything magical, she paused. Tunks sighed. "It's okay. There's nothing magical about it," and smiled encouragingly. "Except that it is alcoholic, because we're over 17. Cecilia looked across to her as she took a sip. The drink tasted lovely. She could definitely taste honey. There was cinnamon and hops and a slight hint of a rounded bitter taste. "See," said Tunks, nodding at Cecilia's approval of the drink. "Told you you'd like it. But I really didn't expect you to react like that," she thought to herself. "It's really affected you." Half an hour later and they were both laughing. Tunks had told Cecilia about her popping into Professor McGonagall's fire by accident and being soundly rebuked for intruding. When Cecilia asked Tunks about her, she regaled her with stories from when she was at Hogwarts and how she had caught Tunks hanging a boy out of the third-floor window by his ankles when he's called her a chameleon. "I didn't know Professor McGonagall was in the castle," said Cecilia, sipping her drink. "What's the reason?" "It's school starting on Saturday, isn't it?" Tunks nodded at her expectantly. "When the students start term." Cecilia nodded, recalling Snape mentioning it a couple of days ago. Hundreds of students, wizards and witches. The place would be quite busy. "Not to worry though, not all of them are as bad as me." Tunks laughed, taking in Cecilia's expression. It was marvelous, thought Cecilia, how little time it had taken for Tunks to put her at her ease. Very much a people person. Like Libby. So completely different to herself. If she had been a person prone to envy, it would have been of the apparent lack of effort the younger woman needed in order to be personable and know exactly the right thing to say and to whom. "That's what comes of my clumsy nature," said Tunks, leaning back. "Clumsy?" said Cecilia. "I haven't noticed. It's usually when I metamorphose. My change in appearance usually makes a great deal of difference." That and when I'm nervous. When I was very much younger and I used to talk to Sirius and James and Remus. I used to be really clumsy then, and they'd all laugh. She added, with a smile. Well, Sirius and James mostly. Not Remus? Asked Cecilia, raising an eyebrow and imagining in her mind's eye Tunks as a hoydenish little thing. No, laughed Tunks. He used to stick up for me and talk to me when I got upset, even when Sirius teased him about it. I suppose he liked me, even then. I liked him too. She sighed, and Cecilia glanced at her happy smile. Of course he never listens to anything I have to say now, even when it's important, said Tunks. He goes and does quite the opposite. I'm really lucky to be able to spend so much time with him. She sipped her butterbeer glass and added wistfully, and while he may not think it himself, but I think he's simply wonderful. Cecilia smiled, remembering how she had felt like that about Tim once, and was pleased for Tunks. So listen, said Tunks, now refocusing her attention back on Cecilia. I know what my stupid cousin did is still making you feel bad. Is it any better out here? Before I answer that, Tunks, there's something I've been wanting to ask you. Cecilia put down her butterbeer and looked back at the young witch. Tunks looked at her, expectantly. Why do you think Remus wanted me to stay back at Grimmauld Place? I've been over and over it in my mind, trying to work it out. Cecilia sighed, and took a sip of her drink. He was there when I woke up from all of that. He was happy when I became a member of the Order. He expressed to me how important the work was for us all. But that's the thing, isn't it? No matter what way I look at it, I can't understand why he would want me to stay at Grimmauld Place when he knew I needed to work here with Snape. I really don't know, Cecilia, she said, smiling back at her. He was pretty put out that Sirius treated you so badly. I know he doesn't like Snape, but he more than anyone knows how important our work is, how important it could be. So you don't think he was just sticking up for his friend then, trying to succeed where Sirius failed? No way, said Tunks, laughing into her drink. He was gutted when he saw what Sirius had done. He even stopped Sirius seeing you when you said you didn't want to see him. I've never seen Remus so annoyed with anyone. Cecilia nodded, then frowned slightly. He tried to stop Sirius seeing her. That didn't sound like someone backing up their friend. Only I just thought ... he might be, you know, trying a different tack. Not that I can't see Sirius's point though, conceded Cecilia. I'd be upset if I thought anyone was going to harm Freya. My goddaughter, she clarified, sipping her drink again and feeling much more relaxed than she had done an hour ago. I just wish that when Sirius was trying to make his point, he hadn't tried to kill me to make it, though. Tunks giggled, and Cecilia smiled too. She was glad Tunks had persuaded her to come out that evening. She could feel the break doing her good. So I can tell Remus you're not angry with him anymore? Cecilia nodded, wondering vaguely why her approval was that important. But it was for Tunks really, wasn't it? Cecilia felt a glow of happiness that Tunks had cared so much about her feelings. Sirius is sorry too, added Tunks, hopefully. He has always had problems with people he has been close to. Do you remember that I said he used to spend a lot of time with me and Mum? Cecilia nodded. The Black family have always been purist, so when Mum married Dad, and Sirius stayed in touch, they disowned him, cut him out of the will and everything. He used to stay with James, Harry's father, in the halls from school. James's parents were so kind to him, and he was over the moon when Harry was born, like a second father to him. He was. Another? Asked Tunks, gesturing to Cecilia's empty glass. She nodded, thanking her. When she returned, a few minutes later, having chatted with Madame Rosmertou about staying in for the duration, Tunks handed Cecilia another drink, and fished out a picture from her pocket. That's me, she said, pointing at the moving image. I was 8 when that was taken, and Sirius and James were 22. She handed it to Cecilia. The picture was taken in what looked like London. Hyde Park, thought Cecilia, if I'm not very much mistaken. James was instantly recognizable. He was almost the spitting image of Harry, only Harry in about 8 years' time. Her glance shifted to the very youthful-looking face of Sirius, nodding inwardly. His face was handsome, his long dark hair framing it perfectly. His eyes still displaying that roguish unpredictability that she remembered from the order meeting. It was no wonder Snape had labeled him a womanizer. What woman wouldn't have fallen for that face? She handed the picture back to Tonks. You're very sweet there, said Cecilia. A special occasion? My birthday, said Tonks, tucking the picture back up inside her robe. I loved going out with them. My big cousin Sirius. Severus said he was popular, mused Cecilia. They all were, all 4 of them. Sirius, James, Remus, and Peter ... always getting into mischief. McGonagall nicknamed them the Marauders. Snape was always the butt of their humor. Him and Malfoy. Always bragging about the things they'd done. Quite awful things actually. She added, taking in Cecilia's horrified expression. She could just imagine it ... that same cold manner, like he was nothing. Despite what Severus must have been like at school, despite how strange and odd he is now, no one deserves to be treated like that. I didn't either. You're right, said Tonks, looking down, and Cecilia realized she'd spoken her thoughts aloud. I can understand why Severus warned me from trusting them. There's good in him, said Tonks carefully. The years he spent in Azkaban, accused of the deaths of his best friends ... the fact he is stuck inside, unable to do anything substantial to avenge them. The loyalty he shows for a friend every month in the forest. Tonks looked beseechingly at her. He is committed to getting rid of you know who ... He's sorry for what he did to you, Cecilia. I can't say I forgive him, Tonks. I'm not sure I can ever say that. But I think we can probably make some sort of amends. I mean, we're both in the order, we're both working towards the same goal. Though I think it may be a long time yet before I visit Grimmauld Place again. She added, smiling over the top of her glass and drawing a subconscious line under what was past. The conversation continued into the night, moving through subject after subject. They talked over Madame Imones's shop, and made plans to visit Mole clothes shops as soon as they possibly could, and Tonks promised to look in on Amy as often as she could too. Cecilia also mentioned Raymond Lully, whom Madame Pomfrey's grandfather had spoken of most cryptically in his notes, and Tonks promised to investigate him before explaining in great detail about the houses at Hogwarts, with particular reference to her favorite sport, Quidditch. It wasn't until when the faint rays of dawn refracted through the Three Broomsticks window that either of them realized they'd spent the whole night in the pub, and Tonks offered to walk her back to Hogwarts. As they walked over the fields towards the school whilst the sun began to rise, Cecilia felt a weight off her mind. 88,888,888. Cecilia followed Tonks back through the secret passage, and back into the school. She felt tired now. It had been a long time since she'd gone out drinking all night, and she'd mentally planned to spend at least some of the morning in bed. Thanks, Tonks, said Cecilia as they got to the door of her room. It's been great seeing you. No need for thanks, replied Tonks, grinning. I enjoyed it too. We'll have to do it again sometime. Her voice trailed and her eyes widened, and Cecilia turned to see Snape coming out of her room. Good night was it, intoned Snape icily, eyeing the two women standing in the corridor. He looked between Tonks and Cecilia, and she noticed how pale Tonks had become and that her hair had become very washed out. And just where have you been? He asked accusingly. With me, said Tonks, nervously. We went out. Her voice went thin and she looked across at Cecilia. And just what has that got to do with you? Asked Cecilia, stepping up to him. As I recall, you left last night without so much as a word. She glanced back at Tunks, the young witch had gone even paler. It has everything to do with me. You were entrusted to my care. It was not safe for you to leave the castle, especially last night. He glared at her, and she stared back. Look, she said firmly. How dare he try to tell her off? You left last night. I didn't know where you were either. I came to look for you. Perhaps you'd like to explain exactly what kind of danger you are referring that I don't already know about? Wandering around the castle at night, especially without the grounds. There are many dangers that even a competent wizard would find challenging. And yet no harm came to me. I was with Tunks. She looked across at the witch, whose face had clicked into an expression of horrified realization. Snape snorted, eyeing Tunks critically. In that case, you might as well have gone looking for trouble, he said, still staring at Tunks. Did the events of a fortnight ago teach you nothing? Cecilia looked across at Tunks, whose hair now resembled icing sugar, and noticed a glimpse of unspoken dialogue pass between her and Snape. Thanks for a great night, she said, her tone laden with meaning. See you soon. Tunks broke away her fixed stare from Snape and began to edge back down toward the secret passage. From a safe distance she looked back at her and, taking in Cecilia's expression of determination, and smiled briefly. Then Cecilia turned back to Snape. So what was that all about? She shouldered past him, and sank onto the bed, aware of the ache down her side beginning to toll. And is that why you're in my room at 5 o'clock in the morning? To check I'm safe? That wretched house elf came looking for me in the middle of the night. According to him, you'd been kidnapped by dark wizards. He looked at her disdainfully, but Cecilia was too tired to care. However, I neglected to account for the measure of foolishness inherent in your kind, so I needn't have worried. Also, Dumbledore is looking for you. Cecilia looked up at him. What? I said, I discounted how stupid moles can be. He folded his arms. No, something about Dumbledore. He's looking for you. He wants to see you. Now. Cecilia got to her feet, trying to imagine what for. She threw open a few drawers, looking for something fresh and clean to wear. Dumbledore wanted to see her now? Did he say what about? She said distractedly, pulling off her jumper. No, said Snape, taking in her semi-clothed appearance. But you might find it beneficial to wear something a bit more suitable. 88,888,888. Cecilia paused before Dumbledore's huge office door. Come, he said, just as she was about to knock. How on earth does he do that, she wondered, and pushed against the heavy door. Ah, Mrs. Frobisher, said Dumbledore, who was sitting before his desk. How are you? Settling back into life at Hogwarts? Yes, thank you, Professor, she said, trying to stifle a yawn. Madame Pomfrey tells me you are making a fine recovery, despite your refusal to remain in bed for as long as she sees fit. He gave her a wink, before continuing. And your work with Professor Snape? He prompted, gesturing towards a large chair that had appeared near the desk. Good, said Cecilia, a little disconcerted. She'd brought her notebook up just in case, but she wasn't sure what to expect. Why would Dumbledore want to see her so early in the morning? Oh, it's the mole, is it? A voice coming from near the fireplace rang out haughtily before Dumbledore had a chance to say anything, and Cecilia turned to see an elderly wizard staring at her, leaning against the left-hand side of his frame. Moles at Hogwarts, he added, sullenly, would never have happened in my day. Phineas, please, said Dumbledore, getting up. This is Cecilia Frobisher. She's working with Severus Snape on the assignment. The man from within the portrait stared back at Cecilia, so she did what any self-respecting teacher would do. "Hello. Fine hours, is it?" she said genially, walking towards Dumbledore. "Nice to meet you." She smiled at the portrait. The man continued to stare, but glanced across at Dumbledore once or twice. "Well, I suppose if she's helping you, Albus, then I suppose that's fine by me." "And me." Another picture chimed in. "Dilys," she said, smiling warmly at Cecilia. "If you need our assistance in any way, my dear, my other portrait is by the entrance to the Great Hall. Please don't hesitate. Anytime. Anytime." "Now that you've met some of the former headmasters and headmistresses of Hogwarts," said Dumbledore warmly, waving his arm towards the row of portraits over the fireplace, many of whom nodded or waved at her, "there are some further details we need to discuss." He paused, waiting for Cecilia to sit back down. "Professor Snape has informed me that your research is underway and that despite the events of a fortnight ago, you have put aside your hesitation of magic to forge ahead." Cecilia nodded in agreement, wondering why on earth he had excused her to Dumbledore. "He also informs me that you have put forth an hypothesis about wizard and moles?" He looked at Cecilia. "In the way that they might be connected?" he prompted. The conversation that she had with Snape yesterday afternoon reformed itself in her mind, and she realized at once that what Dumbledore was talking about was the genetic inheritance. He had been so interested in the meiosis experiment, but because he ran off, she had assumed she had been wrong, or made one too many assumptions, and he was putting her in her place. That is to say, we discussed the possibility of an inherited genetic link between parents and children in the wizard world." Dumbledore nodded. "Do you feel everyone should know about science, Cecilia?" "Yes," said Cecilia quickly. "Up until I came to work here, Professor, I was certain that science answered almost everything that makes up the world, to a greater or lesser extent. However, I feel that more strongly than ever, the longer I work here, because there are so many things that have yet to be explained, yet wizards as a whole have not got a framework by which to interpret them. And there's so much more for us to understand." Dumbledore nodded, looking across at Cecilia over his half-moon spectacles. "On Saturday, our school year begins. The students arrive and their lessons begin on Monday. However, we cannot allow you to be here when this happens. Your work with Professor Snape is vital and must be kept strictly secret." Cecilia felt her heart sink. So she was going to have to leave then. But where to? If he suggests Grimmauld Place, she thought, I'm going to seriously have to consider saying no. "From your testimony just now, may I be right in inferring that you believe everyone should be taught science?" Cecilia nodded, but before she said anything, Dumbledore continued. "In addition to our lessons in magic, Cecilia, we also teach mole studies. Our teacher, Madame Cadwallader, has decided to take a break from teaching. Ordinarily I wouldn't have bothered to replace her, mole studies not being a required owl examination subject and out of the jurisdiction of the ministry. It's not compulsory, but we do encourage it." He paused from pacing before the fire to look at Cecilia again. "I feel that this would be an opportunity to shall we say, kill two birds with one stone. Sorry, Fawkes," added Dumbledore, in response to Fawkes's indignant squawk. Cecilia paused, not quite getting her head round it all. And then it dawned on her. "You're not suggesting you want me to teach here?" She looked down, trying to take it all in. "You want me to teach mole studies to wizard children here?" She looked back questioningly at Dumbledore. "I want you to teach science, Cecilia, as the mole studies lessons. If we say no more than 6 hours a week, this will give you more than enough time to work with Severus in the evenings. This will give you a legitimate reason to remain at Hogwarts, in an environment in which you are familiar. He paced back to his chair, and stopped. And of course, Harry will be here, which will make it extremely convenient for your research. Take some time to think about it, he added, when Cecilia had not replied. Teach science ... to wizards. But they would be children though, wouldn't they? Cecilia thought back to that evening, when she had had supper with Mrs. Weasley and the children. Such insular ideas, such prejudices. Such prejudices which have resulted in one madman to impact on even her life ... not forgetting the countless other lives, Mullen whispered. Is there anything in particular you'd like me to teach? She asked, feeling her mind fill with little arrows, trying to direct her thoughts every which way. Only I could also teach about the wider part of science, the responsibility we have, the history ... I could even try to put it in context with wizard history ... if I had the time, that is. So you are saying that you'll do it, Cecilia? Looking into her eyes and seeing the spark of excitement behind them, he did not wait for a reply. That is excellent. Your first lesson will be on Monday, then. I'll get Professor McGonagall to write you into the timetable. Dumbledore smiled, and Cecilia smiled back, feeling a lot more assertive than she had done in a long time and thinking too what her fate might be if she sank like a stone in front of a class of young wizards. Maybe being a frog wasn't so bad.